Welcome to the Long COVID podcast with me, Jackie Baxter. I am really excited to bring you today's episode. Please do check out the links in the show notes where you can find the podcast website, social media and support group, as well as a link to buy me a coffee if you are able. You should not rely on any medical information contained in this podcast and related materials in making medical, health-related or other decisions. Please do consult a doctor or other health professional. I love to hear from you. If you've got any suggestions or feedback or just want to say hey, then please do get in touch. I really hope you enjoy this episode, so here we go. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Long COVID podcast. I'm really happy to have Moira Newiss with me today. Moira is a nutritional therapist, so we're going to talk about food and long COVID and dig a little bit deeper into why, hopefully. So welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you, Jackie, and thank you everyone that's listening.
So I'm really happy to have you here. Would you mind starting off with giving us a bit more of an introduction to yourself and what it is that you do?
Yeah, okay. So I'm Moira Newiss, as you said. I'm a nutritional therapist and I specialise in helping professionals to beat burnout, chronic fatigue and now long COVID by helping them to get their energy back and get their life back on track again. So I work with people on their nutrition, so their diet, as well as other lifestyle factors for things like how to manage their stress levels, improve their sleep and help find a balance in their life as well. So I'm a fully qualified nutritional therapist. I studied for 3 years at the Institute of Optimum Nutrition in London, and I'm registered with BANT, the British Association of Nutrition and Lifestyle Medicine. And I'm actually also an ambassador for the Public Health Collaborative, which advocates a real food lifestyle for health. And I live and work in Scotland as well. So I'm based on the West Coast near Oban. Maybe if I could give a little disclaimer about what I say today. So when I talk today about nutrition and lifestyle advice, it's really for information today, to give you things to take away, food for thought, and it's not medical or nutrition advice. Please always consult your doctor or a nutritional therapist or another appropriate qualified professional before you make any changes to your diet. And if you're on medication in particular, then changing your diet can result potentially in your medication working differently and requiring it to be adjusted. So it's really important to do in consultation with your doctor.
Yeah, of course, that's definitely important. So how is what we eat linked to how we feel? I'm sure that's a bit of a big question, but...
Yeah, I like that question. Well, I'm thinking that you've probably heard of the saying, we are what we eat, which is kind of commonly talked about. Well, I quite like to say that our mind and body are deeply affected by what we eat and how we live our lives. So food can really affect our mood, but our mood can also impact on our food choices too. And in my view, the best explanation for all of that really is about inflammation, which I think we might talk about quite a lot today. So when we eat food that's got an inflammatory effect on our body, it can affect our biochemistry and it can have a knock-on effect on our hormones and our health. Plus, it can be a bit of a vicious circle, as when we're not feeling great, we often reach for unhealthy foods, and that adds to the inflammation and can make us feel worse, unfortunately. So I think when we get into some of your other questions, we'll probably talk quite a lot more about inflammation, and I'll talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, and this idea that we're coming to talk about it so much more, how interlinked everything is. So in terms of long COVID, I mean, there are lots of theories about what causes it. I mean, I think we don't really know, but we've got all things bouncing around: inflammation, autoimmunity, microclots recently, many, many others. If we don't understand what the sort of underlying mechanism of it is, how can we tailor our nutrition to help?
So yes, there's lots of different possible mechanisms at play, like you talked about, and it might be that some people do find out that they're suffering with one of those processes at play from medical tests and things, but often we're left with a lot of unanswered questions, from our GP or specialist not necessarily being able to explain to us exactly what they think is going on. So as a nutritional therapist, when I'm seeing clients on a one-to-one basis, I will look at the collection of symptoms they're presenting with. I look at the test results that they might have got from their GP or elsewhere. And I'll try and build up a picture of what I think might be going on for that person. So you've touched there on a few of the kind of key mechanisms. The 5 that I'm kind of looking out for that seem to stand out for the medical literature most to me are mast cell activation, neuroinflammation, and something called dysautonomia, which is to do with an imbalance in the nervous system. Microvascular damage, you touched there on the microclotting issue. Something called metabolic dysfunction or imbalances, which we'll probably talk a bit more about as we go. And also something called mitochondrial dysfunction, and that's to do with how we make our energy. We might talk a bit more about that as well. Now, the key thing for me really is that all of these things have inflammation as an underlying kind of factor in the process. And that's why I think we'll end up talking quite a lot about inflammation today. But I think also one of the things to point out is that when you get test results, say, back from your GP, and they're looking, and you might get told, for example, you've got normal results. That doesn't necessarily mean it's optimal for you. It just means that you're within a certain parameter of the population that's deemed as normal. So the normal range is just based on a statistical set of data from the general population. But people who are trained to work in functional medicine, like nutritional therapists and other professions, we're looking really to look at ranges that optimize the functioning of the body. So we're kind of taking a slightly different approach to things as well when we start to look at what might be going on for that person. So when we're talking about inflammation, there's definitely a lot of things we can do with nutrition to help tackle that. And then there are, with some of these other mechanisms, if we suspect that they might be going on, there are some specific things we can also do to look at that too. So I think there I was talking about inflammation perhaps being like an underlying factor in everything, but there might also be other underlying things that are causing a problem, and they might be things that actually were going on in the body before that person got COVID, for example, and getting COVID may either have made them worse, or they may be kind of the ongoing symptoms helping to sort of persist and continuing really. And there are quite a lot of similarities in some relation to this with chronic fatigue syndrome, in that we know there are various factors that help drive chronic fatigue syndrome, and what we don't really know is if they're all the same with long COVID or not. And my best guess with all this is there's going to be similarities and there's going to be differences. So it's really about listening to the person and working out again, what might be going on. So I'd be looking for things like, is the virus still active in the body? Is there still persistence of the viral? Is it still activating the immune system, for example? Has the immune system effectively cleared the virus up, or has it left fragments and debris around that might be adding to the inflammation? And there's things like chronic stress. There's things like, is your gut working really well? So your digestive system, is it functioning well? Are you getting the right nutrients into the body? And so there's all these other things that kind of might be going on that, if the body's not functioning well to begin with, it might not be helping somebody recover, I think is kind of my philosophy and how I'd be approaching things. And I think that an example of how I kind of like to think about this is like almost like there's a tipping point with the body. So if we put it under too much stress, and I'm not just meaning kind of mental or emotional stress, but I'm thinking really broadly about stress, like physical and chemical stress as well, then we can kind of reach a point where the body's biochemistry gets out of balance and it doesn't really cope anymore, and we can get unwell at that point. And I quite like to describe this to people thinking a bit like an iceberg. So you can only see what's at the top of an iceberg, the bit that sticks out of the water. And if you're looking at a person, you might think, well, actually, they look perfectly fine. They look healthy. They look okay. I mean, when I was unwell in my past, that's certainly, I think, how I looked to people. And so what you can't see is the bit that's lurking underneath, the hidden part of the iceberg. And if, there's all these other things going on in the body and the body's not well balanced with its different systems, then, that will probably determine whether somebody gets ill with the virus and becomes unwell, or copes with it fine and hardly has any symptoms at all. And I think that tipping, I sort of see that as the tipping point. Is the body tipping over into being ill? And the virus might simply be that tipping point with all these other things that are going on in life.
Yeah, I mean, how many times do we get told, oh, but you look okay? And yeah, maybe I do, but that's not the whole story, is it?
No, and I think particularly with fatigue, probably, which is probably the biggest symptom for a lot of people, you can look absolutely fine and be completely drained, into the outside world. you might still have a smile on your face. Nobody necessarily knows how you feel inside. So
Yes, yeah, and it's this whole idea of symptoms that are absolutely physical. You are feeling them, but you can't see them, and they don't necessarily show up on tests. And I think that's probably where a lot of the problems with all of this, and certainly a lot of the frustration, is coming out. Oh, your tests are fine, or your levels are normal. It's not very helpful when you're still feeling terrible.
No, and I've been there myself, so I know exactly how that feels. It's really disheartening. Sometimes you're really hoping that you're going to get something that helps explain what's going on, and unfortunately health's not always that simple. So
Totally.
I might just go back and just talk a little bit more about the different kind of stresses that I talked about.
Yeah, sure. Yes, because we all know that stress is a big thing.
I think most of us are aware that we can get under a bit of stress, mental stress, particularly mental or emotional stress. So, if you've got difficulties in your relationship, or you've lost a loved one, or you're being bullied, or even a lot smaller kind of ongoing what we call chronic stresses. So, you might be doing a job that you don't like, for example, or you might constantly have your values compromised in some way in life, the way that you're having to live your life. But then we can be thinking about physical stresses as well. So by that, I mean things like maybe having a very sedentary lifestyle and not moving at all. That's a stress for the body, or even the other excess of doing a lot of intense physical activity. Things like, is your blood sugar well balanced? If it's not, that's a physical stress for the body. And then we've got things like not getting enough sleep, being overweight. Again, these are all stresses on the body. And then we've got the kind of chemical element. So things like, are we taking toxic chemicals into the body, from our food, from our cosmetics, cleaning products? We're living in a world, unfortunately, we're quite surrounded by chemicals. And then, are we connected to nature? Are we out in nature getting the benefits of some of the chemicals that come from the trees and the plants, for example? And even things like noise, excessive noise, that's a stressor, So I think we have to think really broadly about what we're exposing ourselves to overall, because our body doesn't really differentiate in some ways between any of those things. It's just ending at, all what happens really is that there's a biochemical process going on, and we will have different chemical messages going around the body, and our cells listen to those messages, and they eventually decide, are we under too much stress? And that's kind of coming back to that tipping point. So our cells are sensing all the time, and if we, quite often people will say, well, I didn't get ill until I got the virus, which is true, but we don't always take stock of where we are in life, and what stress we're putting ourselves under. And so if we think about the kind of just modern day lifestyle that most of us lead, most of us have stress in our lives from a lot of different factors. That's kind of a little bit with the territory of how we lead a lifestyle today. And then when we get ill, it's just another, this time, infectious stressor for the body. But I think I always try to get people to just think about their life as a whole a little bit more, so that they're kind of beginning to think, what life do I want going forward? What life am I creating? And what is going to be good for me in terms of my health?
Yeah, you mentioned earlier viral persistence. I mean, that's quite an interesting one, because that thought that the virus is still in your body this sort of makes you go, ooh, a little bit. Are you able to talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, so I was talking about it in terms of some of the, looking at what's kind of going on in the body, what processes might still be going on. And there's definitely, the question of, are we still activating our immune system in some way? And that might be from viral persistence. And there are some really interesting studies in the medical literature. There's studies actually from Wuhan, so we're going back a long way in time. So it's interesting to look back and see what's happened to people who got long COVID, who were right at the beginning, for example. And there are a number of studies out there showing that people can have positive virus samples from a variety of different places in the body. So not necessarily just the nasal kind of thing that we think about when we're talking about PCR testing and that kind of thing, but, stool sample testing, organ, body tissue testing, so it might be that the virus is still kind of persisting somewhere in the body. And it might be that we're kind of coping with it to an extent, but maybe the immune system's still, having some kind of activation that's not settling back down. And one of the other things that can happen is we can kind of end up with an overactive immune system in some cases. It can kind of go into a kind of hyper alert. And I think some of the best descriptions of that in the literature to do with neuroinflammation. So if we know that the virus can cross the blood-brain barrier into the brain and get into the central nervous system, which is one reason why we get neurotype or nerve type symptoms with COVID. But when it's in the brain, it can turn on some of our brain immune cells that are called microglia, and they can become kind of primed, and they're quite difficult to turn off again. So again, there are things that we can do to look at that. They're a bit more too detailed to go into today, to be honest, but it's just to give your listeners an idea that, there are things we can look at from a kind of nutrition and lifestyle point of view with some of these things. So we just talked about viral persistence, there's the viral debris side of things, there's the kind of this overactivation of the immune system, and there's autoimmunity that you mentioned, Jackie. And again, if that's been a pre-existing problem for people, we do also know that we can end up with autoimmunity with COVID, but also if you had it pre-existing, then, it can worsen symptoms sometimes. So that's another thing that we could be, looking to deal with. And then there's also things like, I talked about gut health, but really specifically looking at things like our gut, what's called our gut microbiome, which is our collection of bacteria that live in our gut and that we really need to keep healthy. We actually have trillions of viruses, bacteria and yeasts that live on or in us, and we cope with them all the time without any problem at all. And it's only when they get out of balance and we end up with ones that are more what we call pathogenic or more unhelpful, really, and might cause an infection in the body that we end up, if we can't keep that balance right. So that's one reason why eating the right foods, what you put into the digestive tract is really, really important, to keep those bacteria happy.
Yeah, I mean, I remember I was reading a book the other day. It was all about the vagus nerve, and it was talking about how the gut was your second brain.
Absolutely.
And that kind of made me realise partly how everything is connected, but also how important actually it is to keep your nutrition to be healthy or right.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So yes, the gut-brain connection is really, really important. So I think most of us are probably aware that we have a connection between our gut and our brain. If we get nervous, particularly as a child, you probably remember getting butterflies in your tummy. Well, we now know that there is a connection the other way, that your gut or what's happening in your gut connects with your brain as well. So we have this thing called the gut-brain axis, and it's really a communication axis. It's two-way. So the gut communicates with the brain communicates with the gut. And there are certain conditions like, for example, inflammatory bowel syndrome is well known to kind of, have a lot of this communication going on in this axis. So the gut has about 70% of our immune system in it. So that's really interesting as well. It's a large percentage of our immune system. That's why it's so important to have gut health. And then we have, when we eat plant foods, we are eating fibre as part of that. And when the fibre gets in, we don't digest the fibre as humans in our body. It goes into our small intestine and it starts to be fermented by our gut bugs. So the gut microbes that live in our gut, and they ferment these fibres, and in turn they produce really helpful chemicals for us. And this is one reason why it's being talked about as a second brain, is because some of those chemicals that get produced are hormones that act as neurotransmitters. So, there's GABA, which is our calming hormone. There's dopamine, our pleasure hormone, and serotonin, what's known as our happy hormone. So I think, again, it's 70% of serotonin is made in our gut, and that is why our gut can have such a big impact on our brain and our mood. It's really fascinating. And so feeding those gut bugs the right things is really, really important.
We'll be right back. I'm interrupting myself for a second to tell you about long COVID breathing. The fabulous Vicky Jones and I have teamed up to bring you long COVID breathing. We are both passionate about sharing our expertise and experience of the breath and how incredibly helpful that can be with long COVID. We've worked together to develop a course that is specifically tailored to those with long COVID. It's a 6-week course with 12 sessions, all delivered online. The community feel and learning that we're all sharing is such a joy. To find out more information and to sign up for our courses, workshops and other shorter sessions, please check out the link below, longcovidbreathing.com, or email longcovidbreathing@gmail.com to start your breathing journey with us. Yeah, that is fascinating, actually. So there's a lot of people that talk about the antihistamine diet, and I think this is sort of related to MCAS, mast cell activation. And, some people will swear by it. I tried it and it didn't seem to do anything for me, so I went back to eating my bananas and tomatoes, which made me happier. But what are your thoughts on this?
So I think a low histamine diet can be really helpful for some people, but I would caution it can be quite a restrictive diet, depending on how much foods you have to cut out to get the low histamine effect. It is a bit personal. So if you're going to do it, you definitely need advice from somebody competent, like a nutritional therapist or your doctor, just to make sure that it's appropriate to go on to that to begin with. And we might talk a bit more later on about elimination diets or things, but there are some reasons why you don't want to be cutting too many things out of your diet if you don't need to. But a low histamine diet can be really helpful for people that have this mast cell activation syndrome. So mast cells are a type of immune cell that's responsible really for like hypersensitivity or allergic reactions, and they're present in really big numbers in our gut, so in our digestive tract. And if we've got some kind of ongoing immune activation, then mast cells can be activated, and when they break down, they release histamine. So that's when this chemical histamine comes into being, and that then can create inflammation, again that word, and a range of symptoms in people. It can vary quite a lot, so things like hives, it can be fatigue, headaches, muscle pain. There's a big variety of symptoms that people get, and it seems that people who are prone to this condition and then get COVID can quite often have worse symptoms afterwards. In fact, it's more likely to affect their daily life after they've had COVID, with quite more severe symptoms like severe fatigue or severe muscle pain, for example. So one option is to put in a low histamine diet, which basically means cutting out foods that have high histamine content. And so that's things like fermented foods like yogurts, vinegars, beer, wine, sour cream, or things that are like aged or matured, so like cured meats, so things like bacon, salami, for example, or matured cheeses, and then also some things like canned fish, dried fruits, and also some types of vegetables. I think you mentioned tomatoes there, for example. There's aubergines, avocados. But the key thing is that you have to experiment a bit, because everybody has a slightly different response. Some people are more sensitive to a certain amount of histamine. Some people can put, like, eating leftover food is quite, again, how long can you leave it, because it tends to end up with some bacteria in it that can create histamine problems. So everybody's a little bit different with that. But yes, it's definitely something I would consider if you think you might, have that, is to seek some advice.
Yeah, and like you were saying about all of this happening in the gut, I think a lot of the people that have the biggest success with the low histamine diet are the people that have more gut related problems. So I guess that is why.
It could be. I have dealt with people who've tried it without success and have tried it with success. There are other things you can do as well. I would hasten to add that if you think you've got high histamine, there are other things to do with how histamine breaks down in the body that we can look at, and there are different things as well. But it is is one of the steps that you would definitely be looking at if you thought somebody had this mast cell activation syndrome, and you probably need to have some medical input to decide if that's the case as well.
So maybe we should talk about inflammation, because this is something that's cropped up a lot already. So let's tackle that one.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so I think I've said that word probably about 20 times already, but I think it is the bigger one, to be honest. Inflammation seems to be, no matter what you look at in terms of mechanisms, so long COVID inflammation is there. So it would definitely make sense to look at what we can do about that from a nutritional point of view. And the good news is there are loads of anti-inflammatory foods, and they're really delicious. So anybody can have a go, at making some changes into their diet with the right advice, obviously. But basically, the kind of basics of an anti-inflammatory diet are real whole foods. So by this, I mean fresh fruit and vegetables, meat, fish, eggs, dairy, and basically anything you can buy that are in the fresh food aisles of your supermarket. That is really what we want to be looking at in terms of anti-inflammatory. What you really want to be doing is making sure that your plate is full of colour. So plenty of colourful fruits and vegetables. Look at, you want to have the colours of the rainbow as much as possible. And that's because the colours in the fruit and vegetables are really, they represent what's called phytochemicals in the food, and these are our antioxidants. You've probably heard of antioxidants. It's kind of more commonly known word than phytochemicals, but they basically, the antioxidants, they kind of reduce what's known as oxidation in the body, and that's the process that can be damaging to tissue, and as a result, they reduce inflammation. So, if you think of all the delicious foods that are out there, you've got apples, pears, cherries, carrots, chilies, onions, broccoli, cauliflower, cucumber, salad things. There's, picture a lovely plate full of colour of all these things, and just try to get a little bit different every day. Just try and mix it up would be my best advice. There are some other things you can do too. So you want to try and get healthy oils into your diet. So I'm thinking of things like olive oil, coconut oil, and oily fish is a good one. Nuts and seeds as well. So things like chia seeds, pumpkin seeds, walnuts. There's, again, variety there in those kind of things. So yeah, I like to think of the plate being a little bit of a mini ecosystem, really. Like just think about all the different bits of stuff that you can get in there, and that's really anti-inflammatory.
So on the flip side of that, things that are going to be, what would you call them, inflammatory foods? So what would be best to avoid if possible?
The reason I always start with the positive and the anti-inflammatory is if you get your plates full of those things, you won't need as much of the unhealthy things, because there won't be as much room on the plate for it. So as a nutritional therapist, I always try and focus on the positive side of it, what's going to be helpful, what's going to be good for you, what tastes good to get on that plate. But you're right, there are some things that, so what we really want to be avoiding are the really highly processed foods, things that come in packages that are not in the fresh food aisles, that high in sugar, they're high in inflammatory fats, and they're hard to avoid because they can be addictive. The food industry is a massive industry. They put a lot of money into making these things as attractive and addictive as possible, and they're looking for this kind of bliss point that you get, which is that perfect combination of fat and sugar that makes you it's irresistible. And that's what they're looking for. They want you to be addicted to these foods. So the key thing for me is that start by getting the good stuff on the plate, because what you will find is that you're not having to combat that willpower as much to avoid the unhealthy things if you're getting the good stuff in to begin with. But you're talking about things like biscuits and crisps and cakes. I mean, you will know, we all know what they are really. So that's the kind of packaged kind of highly processed food that's also got things like colorings and preservatives. If you look at a packet of food and it's got more than 5 ingredients, chances are it's a processed food, and it's not going to be so good for you.
Great, yeah, that's really helpful. So should different people be eating differently depending on their symptoms? And is there such a thing as a healthy diet for everybody, or will it just vary far too much person to person?
Okay, so I think that when we're talking about the general population, then I would be advocating for a diet that's low in carbohydrates with sufficient protein and sufficient healthy fats. So we're really talking about the kind of fresh foods that we talked about before, the anti-inflammatory foods, and these foods are really nutrient dense. So they're going to be really good for us, providing what we need for the body. But just like you touched on there, individuals will vary. So, everybody is different with what they're presenting with. Some people might have nutrient deficiencies and need extra of certain types of foods, or some people may have allergies and not be able to eat certain foods. And we don't all like the same foods as well. So there's always got to be some personalization of it. And I think the ideal thing is, try and stick with those broad principles and then personalize it for what works for you, really. And some of that will be a little bit of trial and error. Some people might have to cut out some foods that they react to. For example, the common ones would be gluten and dairy. They're the most likely to be people to be reacting to. But if there's somebody who's got high blood sugar levels, for example, they're overweight, then maybe going on a really low carbohydrate diet, so something known as a keto diet, might be a good option for them if they take medical advice. So a keto diet is where instead of burning carbohydrates as your main fuel for the body, you are burning fat instead. And this puts your body into a kind of metabolic state called ketosis. And when this happens, your liver turns fat into small energy molecules called ketones. And they are used by your brain and your other organs as the main energy source in that situation. And when you're burning fat, you feel less hungry, which is a benefit if you're struggling with your weight, for example. And also your blood sugar levels become much more stable. And there's evidence from chronic fatigue patients and also people with conditions, metabolic conditions such as diabetes, for example, that a keto diet can be really helpful. And in fact, in some of these conditions like diabetes, it's now known that for some people it can reverse the condition. But to do this, you definitely need to take advice. It's really, really important to take advice. If you're diabetic, for example, then your medication is almost certainly going to need to be adjusted. So yeah, but it's definitely something that can be really helpful to the body to kind of help you stabilize your energy supply and then give you a bit more stamina as well.
Yeah, you mentioned at the end energy supply, and we were talking earlier about how fatigue is probably certainly one of the most common symptoms with long COVID. Can we talk a bit more about energy production and how that all works?
Absolutely. This is probably my main area of passion, I have to say, so I'll get more excited now. I find it really, really fascinating, this. We probably won't have time to go into the detail today, so I can always come back and talk about it a bit more if you want me to, but we'll kind of squash it into a kind of condensed version today. So you might have heard of mitochondria. I mentioned them a little bit earlier. These are tiny little organelles that are part of almost every cell in the body. Some cells have thousands of them. So cells that need a lot of energy, so like heart, muscle, brain cells, for example, have thousands. And other cells that don't have as big energy requirements have fewer. So things like red blood cells and skin cells, for example. But these little mitochondria, they're sometimes known as our powerhouses because they produce our energy. And they do it in a kind of fascinatingly complicated way. They using the nutrients that we get from our food and the oxygen we get that we breathe in and gets into our bloodstream. But the mitochondria are really, really sensitive to their environment. So they're often described a bit like canaries in the coal mine. They're the first kind of sensors in the body that might say, oh, something's not quite right here. So they're constantly checking their environment for any form of stress. So, just to link that back to what we talked about before about stress, I just mean the kind of biochemical environment in the cell, that can come from any of these types of stresses that we talked about. And if the mitochondria think things are too stressful and conditions aren't good, then they can stop or slow down their energy production. And instead, they prioritize a kind of defense mechanism instead. And this is known as the cell danger response. And it's thought that this might be what's happening with people with chronic fatigue. The cell danger response kind of happens when our body reaches that tipping point that we talked about before. And if too many of our cells move into this defense mode, it's a bit like a survival mode. It's kind of saying, we need to stop, we need to shut down, we need to rest, we need to recuperate. Then we can have problems with our energy supply, and that is why we can feel so fatigued. So it's a lot to understand and all that. There are a few things we can do to try and help with that. First of all, just to go back to the stress, try to reduce that total load of stress really on the body from all those different aspects. It's quite useful maybe to think of examples of lifestyles maybe. So if you have a really stressful job, you might be a senior manager in a company or something, maybe you're getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning every day so that you can go and hit, you get your gym sessions in, really high intensity gym, and then you hit the office, for a really stressful 9-hour day, and then you might come home and have to sort your kids out or something, that's probably not a very good overall environment, and your mitochondria might cope with that for a while, and then they might say, this is just too much. Think of another example. You might have someone who is a bit overweight, they're struggling to exercise, they've got blood sugar problems. They might have a lot of other stress going on, like they might be caring for an elderly relative or have a child who's ill. And some of these things, some of these stresses we can do something about and some we can't. And I think it's really about looking at what we can do and really thinking about how we optimize our lifestyle to help us. So that's like the first thing. And I know that's not an easy thing to do, and that's probably a whole nother podcast for you to talk about. But the second thing is what we talked about there about fueling our body with energy and nutrients. A low carbohydrate diet is what your mitochondria thrive on. So you want to spend at least some of your time in ketosis. So some of your time burning fat instead of carbohydrates, because that makes your body become efficient at burning both, and it's called metabolic flexibility. And as I said before, burning fats, it gives you longer lasting energy and more stamina as well, and it helps balance your blood sugar so you're not getting those dips when you feel really fatigued in the day as well, if it's to do with blood sugar levels peaking and troughing. And the last thing would be just making sure you get the right nutrients to support your mitochondria. They've got specific nutrients that they need to keep all their complicated system functioning. Things like CoQ10, selenium, zinc, magnesium. There are lots of different nutrients. So really it's about making sure we get that nutrient dense diet from whole real foods.
So, I mean, a lot of people have been talking about taking all sorts of supplements and things to the point where they are literally rattling. How do we know, and is it better to get those nutrients from our food?
I would always say food first. So, if somebody comes to me and their diet isn't optimal, you would try and optimize the diet to begin with. Now, it doesn't mean that they won't necessarily need some supplements. There are ways to check for that. So we can do some blood tests to check for nutrient levels. That's most of the time done privately. Your GP might do some tests, like iron is quite often tested for. So they might do some tests. And, if you want to ask for that, they might be willing to do some. But if you want to do a full nutrient panel screen, then that's generally done privately. What I would be doing is looking to see whether that person's got enough of the foods that contain those vitamins and minerals in the diet. And if they haven't, I'd be trying to negotiate with them how we could fit that into the diet and what would work for them. And then there are certain supplements that maybe you might think about adding in at that stage, but that would be I would have to personalize that for the individual at that point, really.
Yeah, because there's all sorts of people listing massive long lists, and I'm sort of thinking, I've never even heard of some of those things. Is that a good idea? And it will differ person to person, I guess, will it?
It will. And at the end of the day, what you take in through your mouth, you've got to think, how well is your gut working? What are you actually absorbing into the body? Because if your gut is not functioning as well, you might not be absorbed. You might be taking very expensive supplements and not be getting the benefits of them, for example. So there are certain things that you'd want to do to try and optimize how the body's functioning before you put a lot of expensive supplements in, for example. So
we'll be right back. Hey there, I'm just jumping in for a second to see if you're enjoying this episode. If you're finding it useful, maybe you would consider sharing it somewhere, a friend, a group, or even on your Twitter feed. If everyone was able to share just once, we'd be able to get this information out to even more people who really, really need it. So please consider sharing somewhere if you possibly can. I hope you enjoy the episode, and thank you so much. So you mentioned earlier, we were talking about, I think it was histamine and all sorts of things, and elimination diets. Is that something that people could be doing or should be done under sort of supervision, for want of a better word? What are your thoughts on that?
I would definitely say under supervision. And the reason for that is that you really want to keep your diet as diverse as possible. Especially where fruits and vegetables are concerned. The benefits that we talked about from all the colours and all the fibre that's going in and are keeping our gut bugs really healthy, so they help us thrive, for example. We don't want to be taking too many things out of the diet, because then we're possibly causing other problems. And one of the issues with elimination diets is if they become too restrictive and you end up eating the same foods over and over again, for example, then that puts you more at risk of having a reaction to those foods, because what you're doing is you're constantly presenting them to your immune system. And if you keep doing that, then there's more of a risk that your immune system might say, oh, I might start reacting to that one. And then that would make you have to take more out of your diet. So it can be a bit of a vicious circle. So when I work with somebody if I'm eliminating anything from the diet normally, there's obviously different situations. But if somebody thinks they're reacting to certain foods, then we might take them out of the diet, but we'd also then be doing work on their gut health to improve it, so that we're reducing the inflammation. We're going to make sure that the lining of the gut is working really efficiently, so we're not getting things crossing into the bloodstream that are unwanted. So bits of bacteria or other things that might be creating other inflammation in the body. We want to be doing that first. So we're kind of what I would call heal and seal the gut in a way. So kind of reducing the inflammation and making sure that we've not got what's called a leaky gut. It's technically called intestinal permeability, but it's basically about things getting across that barrier that we don't want to get across the barrier. And so what we'd be doing is kind of doing that work, and then we'd be looking to reintroduce those foods, because actually if your gut's working really well, you might not be reacting to those any longer. You might be able to tolerate them as part of a normal diet, and that's what you really want. That's the position you want to get to, is that you've reintroduced any foods and that you're coping with them is the ideal scenario. It doesn't always happen, of course, but that would be the ideal.
Yeah, so it's like the underlying thing that you want to get working is your gut, because then most of the other things may not be problems.
That's what I would say. Yeah.
Awesome. So, with a long illness, I've found it's important to find some little things that make me happy. It was someone else I spoke to on the podcast, and she talked about the happy list. So the little things that can make you smile when you're having a bad day. And I think for a lot of people that will probably include not quite so healthy foods. So for me, chocolate or cakes. And is there a balance that we can find between eating little bad things that make us happy and not impacting too much on our overall sort of nutritional health?
Yeah, so I think we touched earlier that there are loads of delicious foods that are actually really good for you. So that's one thing I would remind people of is, maybe actually eating some lovely cherries might be the treat that you're looking for today. I love strawberries, for example. There are other things that, a little bit of dark chocolate, 85% dark chocolate, it's good for you. It's got those good plant chemicals in it, so there are things. I mean, I quite like to have a square dark chocolate and a coffee. I do drink decaffeinated coffee, that's my preference, but that, to me is a really nice treat. So there are things that are not necessarily unhealthy that you might see as a treat. So that'd be the first thing I would say. And then I think the key thing is that nobody is perfect. None of us are perfect in this world. And when you do eat something unhealthily, you don't want to be judging yourself or berating yourself, for doing it. You want to accept it and just put your focus on after that moving forward again and, looking after yourself and nourishing your mind and body. And I do think that one of the difficulties is that we're under a lot of intense kind of pressure from the way society is these days. It's hard to walk into a shop and not see unhealthy foods. They're not presenting you with the healthy treats, for example. And that makes it quite difficult. So I would say that if, it's one thing having a little treat occasionally, but if you're finding that treat becomes every day, for example, and you're struggling with it, I think try to enlist the help of your support system, your friends, your family, get them to join you on this mission that you're going on to make your food healthier. And then if you can manage to get, most of your diet full of real wholesome foods, then, if you eat a slice of delicious cake because it's somebody's birthday, it's not really going to matter because 95% of the time you're on a healthy diet, and you've also got that metabolic flexibility that you can burn the fats and you can burn those carbohydrates in the cake, and it won't be a problem for you. So I think it's just a little bit about changing your mindset that overall you're moving towards health. Having the odd treat, if you're doing that, it's not going to be as big a problem as if that treat is every meal or every snack, and think about what you really like that is actually good for you as well. Can be another way around it.
Definitely, because I think, when we talk about a treat, we always think about something unhealthy. But like you pointed out, actually strawberries are going to make you feel much better in every way, really, aren't they? Because then you're not going to have that guilt either.
I know, and I do think the other thing to think about is that treats don't always have to be food. Maybe having a lovely bath with a candle on and some aromatherapy oils, or, there are other things that if food is kind of like, it's difficult for you to manage, that if you start eating something unhealthy, you won't stop again, for example, then maybe treat yourself to something else, a film night. Or so I think quite often we do use food kind of as that treat kind of mentality in a way, and maybe shifting that onto other things as well is quite helpful too.
It is. It does tend to be a go-to, doesn't it? You mentioned earlier about sleep, and I think certainly for a lot of people with long COVID, they've been struggling with sleep. I know I do from time to time. And is there a way that we can make our sort of food intake benefit our sleep at all?
That's a great question. So yeah, sleep so important. It's one of those things that's just not optional. We can't survive without sleep. We all know how bad we feel if we have a couple of nights with really poor sleep. It really affects your mood, what you want to do, everything. And it helps us restore our energy levels as well. And I think we all know that kind of anyway, but it does, there is a process going on there. And also our body's repairing itself at the cellular level while we sleep. So that's one of the reasons why sleep's also so important. But just to bring it back to the food, we have what's known as a 24-hour body clock in our bodies, technically known as the circadian rhythm, but basically nearly all species actually have some kind of ongoing rhythm between wake, so like a wake and active phase, and a sleep and resting phase. And that should kind of be in sync with the day and the night. And so daylight is one of the main factors that helps control that. So with food, one of the key things we want to be doing is trying to eat as much as we can within daylight hours. Now, I know we live in Scotland, and I know daylight for us is not, great as it is if you're living further south. But what we want to do is kind of tell the body that it's daytime, and the body kind of expects us to be eating as much as possible in the daytime. So ideally, avoid late night snacking, avoid eating at night, try and have your meal at least 2 hours before bed. I would actually say preferably 3 or 4. So, maybe if you're eating at 6 o'clock, going to bed at 10 o'clock, that would be a good window to kind of leave there. And that is one of the mechanisms that helps keep your 24-hour body clock working properly and signaling to your body that it is then time to sleep in the night phase. And one of the other things you can do, it's not about food, but there's really good evidence for it as well, is get bright light first thing in the morning. Get outside or use a sad lamp. I've got a little tiny sad lamp that sits on my desk here, but I have a big one that we use in the morning at breakfast, again, because we're in Scotland in the dark in the morning this time of year. But, daylight is the best. Get outside for 30 minutes in the daylight, because that is also helping to sync your body clock and will help you sleep as well. I mean, there's loads more on sleep as well, but I'd say they're probably two of the biggest things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've all done that, where we've felt really sleepy after a really big late meal and then gone to bed and felt sleepy but not sleepy.
I know there's that, because your body's still trying to digest it, and then all that process goes on a lot longer than you think, really, because it's got to get right into your system, start digesting and absorbing it all. So I think actually there is one other tip that I would definitely say, is that try and avoid bright light before you go to bed. That will be the other thing, is, when it's dark before you go to sleep, don't confuse this mechanism in your body, by giving it bright light, because that is going to tell it that it's daytime, it's active time, so try and keep your lights down, avoid as much screen time. Don't be looking at your phone in bed just before you go to sleep. Again, it's kind of like common sense, but unfortunately we're so used to and addicted to screens and things these days, it's quite hard to. I mean, one of the things that I think it's worth remembering is that if we go back, not that long, over 100 years ago, before electricity was invented, so maybe a bit longer ago now, maybe it's more like 150, but people were sleeping about 9 hours a night, and now a lot of people are lucky to get more than 7 hours. So in less than 100 years, we've lost 2 hours of sleep, and we have not evolved fast enough to cope with that. We just haven't. So a lot of us are probably not getting enough sleep and finding it difficult to sleep because we're doing things that don't support our natural. If you imagine you're a hunter and gatherer living outside, what would you be doing when it was dark? Probably not a lot is the answer.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? I never thought about that. Well, thank you so much for chatting to me today. It's been absolutely wonderful to hear about all of this, and I'll certainly be putting some of your tips into practice. It's made me realise that I could be an awful lot better than I am. So thank you so much.
I've got a long COVID checklist. It's like my personal long COVID checklist that people can download. It doesn't cover everything we've talked about today, but it gives you really good tips and a really great starting point if you're struggling and you don't know where to start and some of the basics. So I think you're going to put the link in the show notes for people, but my website is www.moiranewiss.co.uk. That's got 2 S's, and then it's /long-COVID-checklist. So if people want to go find that and download that, then I say print it out and put it on your fridge. It's there to remind you every day what you need to be doing for some of the basics.
Exactly, because it's so easy to forget some of those just very simple things, isn't it?
And I hope it's really helpful for everybody. Some of these messages really hit home, and that people find they've got something they can take away, and keep it simple. Just try one thing at a time, make it into a new habit, and then try the next. That's what I would say.
Thank you so much to all of my guests, and to you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it, or at least found it useful. The Long COVID podcast is entirely self-produced and self-funded. I'm doing all of this myself. If you're able to, please go to buymeacoffee.com/longcovidpod to help me cover the costs of hosting the podcast. Please look out for the next episode of the Long COVID podcast. It's available on all the usual podcast hosting things. And do get in touch and